Hey, are we ready, Kathy? Hi, good morning. I'm Dale Quigley, the District Governor nominee designee for one more month. And I'm so happy that you could all join us here today for our next Friday feature. I am unsure how many we are at now, but they've been highly successful and we're so glad that you're here. Also with us today is Paul Perez, the current District Governor, and Kenny Klausner, the District Governor nominee. I don't think I saw Ed up, but if so, warm welcome to Ed, the upcoming District Governor. Just to let you know, we will be doing a question and answer period at the end of the presentation. So somewhere right around 9:30 or so, we'll open it up for questions and answers. If you want, please go ahead and just type your question into the chat box. I'll be monitoring that throughout the program and then be handing out the questions when we get to that point. So that's the best way to get a question in. And introducing our program today, we have Randy Comfort. He is from Mounds Park Academy, where he is the Director of Guidance. He's also in the North St. Paul Maplewood/Oakdale Club, and I will hand it off to him to introduce our speakers. Thanks, Randy.
Well, good morning, everyone. Good to see all these faces on here, and I'm glad to be here representing the North St. Paul Club and part of this feature today. So I'm the Director of Guidance here at Mounds Park, and we're a school in St. Paul, right on the edge of North St. Paul as well. And it's a college preparatory pre-K through 12 school. Today we have a very special feature, and I'm honored to be able to introduce them. Their work is extraordinary. Starting with a student, we have Salma Al-Masri, who is here today. She's just finished her junior year, is about to become a senior here at MPA. And we have Katie Murr, a senior social studies teacher for juniors and seniors primarily, and she is here as they'll introduce their own project. She's an extraordinary teacher, extraordinary person, as is Salma as well. So it's really my honor to get out of the way and let them do their thing. Their project they will describe as to what they did. It's a pretty special thing to see this sort of relationship that happens with life beyond just the classroom and learning. So I'll turn it over to Katie and Salma to introduce themselves further. But again, thank you for your time today, and hopefully this is something that you'll really value and cherish.
Thank you, Randy. Salma, I think you can share your screen. So if you want to go ahead and put that presentation up. So thank you, Randy, for that introduction. I'd just like to point out, even before we get started, we're just 1 week off the 76th anniversary of D-Day. So this is a really appropriate time, I think, for Salma and I to be here and tell this story. And as the history teacher, it's kind of my job to give context, but Salma's really going to talk about the heart of the work that we did. But I'll tell you a little bit about the program, about World War II to kind of set up Salma. Last winter, so actually the winter of 2018, Salma and I were accepted into the Albert H. Small Normandy Institute. And we, along with 14 other student-teacher pairs from across the country, spent a semester studying D-Day. So we actually took online classes before the entire country took online classes. That was kind of how we learned over the course of the semester. And also during that semester, we were tasked with researching and writing a biography about a Minnesota soldier who is buried in the Normandy American Cemetery in France. And then all of that work culminated first with a trip to Washington, D.C. to study at George Washington University and at the National Archives, where we were able to pull records related to our soldier and his unit. And then we were able to travel to France to see the D-Day beaches and to actually eulogize our soldier. So we're here today to share all of that work with you. As I said, my job is to give you a little bit of history. If this is review for you, please don't see it as insulting. I think it's always important to remind people about the importance of World War II and its place in our history. So Salma's going to advance to a map of Europe that helps us to understand exactly what was going on with D-Day. So World War II represents a sustained period of grave danger and effort for the United States. I mean, that's kind of an understatement, but it needs to be stated anyway. 16 million men from the United States fought in World War II. That represented 56.4% of men at the time. 405,399 Americans were killed during the war. And part of what made World War II so difficult is that the United States had to fight in both the Pacific and the Atlantic to push back Imperial Japan, Nazi Germany, and Fascist Italy. And we also need to be reminded that those three powers, the Axis powers, threatened the core of democratic values and human rights. So this really was a moment of grave danger, not only physically for the United States and its allies, but also for its values. D-Day itself it's sort of synonymous, I think, with the war. And D-Day simply is the day that the United States and its allies reinvaded Northern Europe, but not simple as in it was an easy task, but that was just the basic goal, that the United States and its allies had to reinvade Northern Europe. And it was a pivotal day in World War II. It was the third deadliest day in United States history. 2,499 Americans were killed that day. But despite the fact that it's so pivotal and so important, I think sometimes people almost think that the war ended on D-Day, and that is not correct. D-Day didn't end the war. It didn't even end the wider campaign for Normandy. It took 3 additional months for the Allies to make it to Paris, and the war would drag on for almost an additional year after D-Day in Europe, and for longer than a year in the Pacific. So D-Day is really, really critical, but it did not end the war. But let me give you a little bit more context for D-Day itself. As this map indicates, Germany had advanced all the way through Southern Europe and into North Africa. If you look just under the words Mediterranean Sea, you can see that North Africa is red. And so Germany had advanced all the way into North Africa, had advanced all the way to the east to Moscow. German troops reported being able to see the spires of the Kremlin, right, but never quite made it into the central part of Moscow. And then all the way to the Atlantic and the west, right, just not taking the British Isles. And so the basic job of the Allies was to push Germany and, like I said, Fascist Italy back into their borders, right? Russia was doing this from the east very slowly. And then Britain and the United States in particular were going to push first from the south, and then eventually we were going to have this northern invasion. If you could advance one slide, Selma. The northern invasion was going to be really critical. There was a lot of debate about where this invasion would take place. Would it come from the south? Would it come from the north? Eventually, the Allies said, yes, it has to come from the north. But even then, there was this debate about, well, where would it be? Would it be at Calais, which is the shortest distance between the British Isles and the mainland? Would it be, elsewhere along the Atlantic Wall? And eventually, they settle on that area where the blue lines emanate from that northern part of France, which is Normandy. And the idea was, if you look to the east, that a northern invasion would give the Allies a straight shot to Berlin. They needed to be able to essentially decapitate the state, right? Get to the center of Nazi Germany and end Nazi Germany at its core. And so a northern invasion was going to be critical. And they settled on Normandy. And this was going to be a massive operation. It was a joint operation that involved 14 nations, and it was going to be the largest amphibious invasion in world history. On June 6th, 156,000 troops went ashore, but eventually 1 million Allied troops would be involved in the wider campaign for Normandy. So this is a huge effort in terms of human power. 9,000 boats and ships were involved in the Normandy invasion. If you don't know the difference between a boat and a ship carries a boat. So some joked that you could literally kind of tiptoe across the English Channel that day by jumping from boat to boat, just because of the massive force that was involved. Selma, if you could go to the next slide. In terms of the D-Day beaches themselves, the Normandy beaches were divided into 5 beaches. There you see them: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. The Americans were going to be responsible for Utah and Omaha, the Canadians for Gold and Sword, or sorry, the British for Gold and Sword, and the Canadians for Juno. If you've ever wondered where those names came from, Omaha and Utah were supposedly named for 2 non-commissioned officers who were standing outside of the planning room. They were guarding the room. One of the planners stuck his head out and said, "Where are you from?" And one replied, "Utah." "Where are you from?" The other one replied, "Omaha." There are those names. Gold, Juno, and Sword were supposedly named for fish, which makes sense for 2 of them, goldfish and swordfish. Juno Beach was supposed to be jellyfish, and the Canadians said that they would not invade a jellyfish. So one of the officers said, "I will rename it for my wife." Juneau. So you can kind of interpret that however you want. But those 5 beaches amounted to a 60-mile invasion zone. If you've ever been there, I think it's hard to understand how wide 60 miles is, but it takes a huge amount of time to get from one beach to the other. So this is just a massive zone. These 5 beaches were part of the larger Atlantic Wall, and Germany had set up this massive defensive system against an invasion. Germany understood that there needed to be a northern invasion. This strategy really wasn't a surprise. And so they took 1 million German soldiers and placed them all along the Atlantic. These soldiers were a mix. Some were not even German. Many were Soviet and Polish POWs. Some were old, some were young. Some were part of elite divisions like the Panzer divisions and the SS divisions. So you had a real range of what was going to be encountered. In addition to having those million soldiers, bunkers were built at least every kilometer. They were denser in some places. That that actual wall, portion of the wall, took 10% of all of the concrete produced in Germany during this time. And the essential goal was to create interlocking fields of fire, where the bunkers would be able to rain artillery shells down on any part of the Atlantic Wall at any point in time to prevent an easy invasion. And then they had also mined the English Channel to make it difficult for an amphibious invasion at all. And I alluded to this before, the last sort of barrier isn't anything physical or even human, but it's just knowledge. The Germans knew that an invasion has to happen. They didn't know exactly where it would happen. There was some suspicion that it might be at Normandy, but the general consensus would be that it would be further north at Calais. So they were ready for an invasion at any point, but they just didn't know quite where it would happen or when. That was the other thing. Timing was uncertain. Selma, if you could advance to the next slide. Our particular soldier was actually not part of that amphibious invasion, though. He was part of the airborne divisions. In addition to that amphibious landing that we've seen depicted in so many movies, there also was an airborne component where paratroopers would be dropped behind enemy lines and have to fight to the beaches to protect those soldiers who were landing. So you see the 82nd Airborne there in the upper left-hand corner, that red and blue logo, and then you see the Screaming Eagles below it. That's the 101st Airborne, and then you also see a British division further to the east. Our particular soldier was part of the 101st Airborne Division, the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment, and Selma is going to pick up the story from here and talk about what he did in his role in this invasion.
So when we were accepted into the Albert H. Small Normandy program, a teacher at our school, an English teacher, came forward to us and he heard that we were going to be visiting the American Normandy Cemetery. So he shared that he had a family member who was buried there, and he asked us to take a photograph for him. But it seemed like taking a picture wasn't enough to honor this man's life. So that's where it became clear that we would have to choose him as our soldier to research and write a biography on. So as I'm sure many of you know, archival research can be very challenging. It's difficult to find exactly what you're looking for, especially when it's on a particular person. So there are very few documents that we were able to find that were tied specifically to PFC Lawrence T. Riley's name. So that means that we had to follow the movements and documents on what his company and his division were doing. So this whole conclusion is based on a number of different scraps, for lack of a better term, where we've sort of made reasonable assumptions, really, on what his movements and service likely looked like. So PFC Lawrence T. Riley is a resident of Hennepin County. He went to De La Salle High School in Minneapolis, and he was noted as a remarkable athlete. He was a varsity letter recipient on the football team, and even the Minneapolis Tribune, when it had existed, notes him as a key veteran player in securing the Minneapolis football championship. Now, from this point on, it's a little bit unclear whether or not Larry Riley graduated, although we're sure that he did. Nonetheless, he married very quickly and he had 3 children. And just like millions of Americans during the Great Depression, he struggled economically. He relied on government work programs. He worked for the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, in street construction. And the 1940 census indicates, if you look at my cursor here, that he was only employed for 12 weeks out of the year. So finances clearly were a struggle at this time. So when we move forward, Larry Riley may have joined the war not just to fight for democracy, but to support his family financially. We know this because he was a part of the 101st Airborne, as Ms. Murr mentioned, to be specific, the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment, which was a group that was on a strictly volunteer basis. And that was because they offered an extra stipend for all of its members, and that would have surely supported him and his family financially throughout the war effort. But additionally, this was a very elite group that required rigorous training. And as I mentioned, he had significant athletic talent, and that would have served him really well through lots of runs, calisthenics, and jumping off of these 100-foot towers as pictured right here. Now, later on, Larry Riley and his unit would move to England to solidify their plans on what their missions would look like when they would land behind the D-Day beaches. And at this time, he's writing letters home, and he has very little to complain about, despite how challenging and rigorous all this training is. In this letter here, you can see that he asks how Christmas dinner is, and he states that finding beer is like finding water in the desert. Now, at one point, there was no time left for training, and the big day was coming. So this photo, which is often attributed to D-Day, I'm sure you've seen it before, is of General Eisenhower giving a pep talk to the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment, of which Larry Riley was a part of. So this was just taken moments before the men were about to board their planes and jump behind the D-Day beaches. So Larry Riley very well could have been in this famous photo hearing General Eisenhower speak. Now, as Ms. Murr mentioned, Larry Riley was a part of an effort to jump behind the D-Day beaches on Utah Beach, near the city called Carrington right here. And I'd like to note here, we know that he landed successfully, but this is a significant achievement. I mean, these men were jumping out of planes that were moving at 150 miles per hour. They had upwards of 125 to 150 pounds of gear on their back. So often, unfortunately, men didn't land on their targets. They would get caught in the tops of trees or on the roofs of people's houses, or even worse, in bodies of water. So the fact that he landed successfully is a significant achievement to note. But additionally, from there on, he was a part of a mission to secure 2 causeways on the beach. And it was so successful that when the Germans had approached them, they panicked and retreated. But at this point, the men, PFC Riley and the rest of the men in his unit, were told that just after a few days of hard fighting, their mission would be over. That was not the case, because after they secured those 2 causeways, their general had surprised them with a surprise mission to take the city of Carrington right here. So I mentioned that Larry Riley has very few documents that are tied to his name specifically, but one that we were able to find was this morning report, which indicates that he died at the Battle of Carrington. And given that he died on June 11th, we followed his unit's movement up to that day, and we looked at what his unit was doing on that day to see how he likely passed away. And that's what I'm going to move through with you all right now. So the battle to take Carrington was made famous by the television program Band of Brothers, if any of you have seen it. So on the 3rd episode, we have the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment coming in from the east. But right now we have Larry Riley's unit, the 502nd, coming from the northwest. And this battle was strategic in taking, and it had the mission to take this German strongpoint right here at this farmhouse. And that would require the men to cross this road called the N13 and 4 bridges. And this road was later dubbed the Purple Heart Lane because of the large number of casualties that had surmounted. Now, the Germans were strategic in that they flooded the land around the roads. So the men were unable to walk in it and were forced to walk along an elevated road right here, and they were exposed to German machine gun fire. And even at night when they were sleeping, 2 German Stuka bombers had strafed nearly an entire unit. Nonetheless, PFC Riley and his comrades successfully reached the German strongpoint and crossed all 4 bridges. But as you can see right here, it's an open field. So this subjected them again to heavy machine gun fire, and bombs were dropping from the sky above them. So they were really in a desperate moment to be able to reach the farmhouse. And I'll tell you right here that their leader, Lieutenant Colonel Cole, had made the desperate decision to order one of the few bayonet charges of World War II, which would be later known as Cole's Charge. And this is likely where PFC Riley died, but I'm going to read you the words that Lieutenant Colonel Cole had read to his, or no, he hadn't read it, but I'm going to read it, had expressed to his men before he called the charge. He said, "These goose-stepping heinies think they know how to fight a war. We're about to learn them a lesson. I'm going to put such an artillery barrage on them that we hope they'll be addled. I want you to put your bayonets on your rifles. We'll call for smoke. When you hear me, blow the whistle, get up and charge to the orchard behind that farmhouse." So this was a brutal battle, and it's likely where PFC Riley passed away. Nearly 54 men of his unit were killed. And I'd also like to mention that his company, H Company, were the first to reach the door of that farmhouse. They were successful in securing it, however, and we had the opportunity to visit the same house that I was in the picture previously, and you can see that there's an American flag, and likely somebody lives there now. So when we visited it last summer, there's not much else to say than it was an incredibly moving and emotional moment. Now, the other thing is that I mentioned that Larry Riley had 3 children who he left when he passed away, and they were all under the ages of 6 at their father's death. And part of the story of war is not just about the story of the individual and the soldier, but it's also on the impact that it has on that soldier's family. And we understood that the impact on PFC Riley's family and his children in particular was profound. They knew very little about their father growing up. So we had the opportunity last spring to share our biography with his son, Robert, who's pictured right here, and fill in some gaps on his father's story, which again was an incredibly moving, emotional moment. And I'll end here today by saying that of the thousands of men who were buried in the American Normandy Cemetery, very few of them would have had a formal funeral or would have been eulogized. So at the end of this program, each student had the opportunity to visit their soldier's grave and eulogize them. So I'm going to share the eulogy that I wrote for Larry Riley right now for you. Over the course of the last several months, I have had the privilege of learning the story of a man whose sacrifice for his country is unquantifiable. PFC Lawrence T. Riley was 27 when he lost his life in the invasion of Normandy. His 3 children, Lawrence Thomas, Sandra Lee, and Robert, were only 5, 6, and 2 years old when their father died, and their recollections of him are fragmented at best. This is a letter to them. Dear Lawrence Thomas, Sandra Lee, and Robert, on June 11th of 1944, your father bravely lost his life in the invasion of Normandy. In the days leading up to his death, he and his comrades of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment fought along a highway called the N13 to aid in the Allied capture of Carentan. It was on this road, dubbed the Purple Heart Lane, that your father died. But you already know these basic details. What has been obscured, however, is PFC Riley's full D-Day story, the story that is unique to him and sacred to you. Unfortunately, there are very few traces of your father. His military records were lost in a fire, and only a few letters and documents specifically tied to his name exist. Your father, however, is not so easily defeated, for it is his character that survives and outshines a lack of physical evidence. In the scraps of paper that remain, a clear picture of a hero, a man who would give anything to his team, a man who was resilient, a man who was unbelievably brave, emerges. In the fall of 1934, a local Minneapolis paper published an article highlighting his high school football team's 2nd consecutive championship. Your father was noted as one of 2 key veteran players on the team. He was recognized as a remarkable athlete in the yearbook and school newspaper. Clearly, he was not to be trifled with on an athletic field, but skill alone could not have led to all these victories and honors. Even as a hotshot football player, your father was learning to be a member of a team. He was learning when to lead and when to follow, when to support and when to reach out for support. And it's clear that he took all of these skills with him when he joined the paratroopers in 1943. During the exhaustive training required of a paratrooper who would land on D-Day, your father subscribed to becoming a member of a team once again. In the final days before the invasion, your father and his unit simulated the missions they would carry out, leaning over sand tables to discuss the right strategies and solidify their plans. Each soldier had a particular role, and the success of the mission hinged on the ability of the men to succeed both individually and collectively. Partnership and teamwork must have proved critical, which is why these men, including your father, saw themselves as a part of a tight-knit brotherhood. If anything is sure of your father's character, is that he was always a member of a team. But it wasn't just teamwork that defined him. He was also resilient. With numerous challenges facing him, he had few complaints. While your father was in Britain, training day and night, the only hint of dissatisfaction in his letters home was a reference to the army working the devil out of us, and to the fact that getting beer was like getting water in the desert. Even when he jumped from his C-47 with 150 pounds of gear on his back and flak flying all around him, I highly doubt he was focused on anything other than his mission. In the push to take Carentan, he and his comrades braved heavy German fire, crawling along the road in a vain attempt to shield themselves from countless bullets. They witnessed Luftwaffe attacks that strafed entire units and eliminated so many members so quickly. And they still proceeded into one of the few bayonet charges of World War II, struggling across an open field to take a German strong point. Spirits were not broken. Your father and his comrades kept going when others would have turned back. They were nothing short of resilient heroes. Ultimately, the best measure of your father's character is that in the words of the battle hymn of the Republic. He died to make men free. As I'm sure you know, the D-Day invasion was the beginning of the end of the most barbaric war in history. If the invasion had failed, democracy, freedom, openness, and equality, the values we so cherish today, would have been extinguished in Europe and threatened at home. The overwhelming importance of the battle might make your father seem small, but that is not how I see it. I have learned his story of alliance. I have learned his story of resilience. I have learned his story of sacrifice. Although the details may be sparse, his heroism looms large. Thank you.
Selma, that was amazing. And I should say, Katie, your part was amazing too, but I think it's Selma's part that just is heart-wrenching. I have a question for you, Selma, and then I'll go on to some of the other ones. How do you think, because this experience has to have changed you, how do you think that you've changed going through this?
Right. There are lots of ways that this experience and all of this research has changed me in following this man's story. But the main thing that sticks out to me is that I grew up in a household that had a very expressed lots of anti-war sentiment. And when I was young, I took that the wrong way to mean that all wars were unjust and that any person's commitment to the military was unjust. Because when my parents expressed anti-war sentiment, they were idolizing people like Muhammad Ali. And they were talking about unjust wars like Vietnam. And being young, I didn't understand that that couldn't be applied and generalized to everything. So what I learned from this was, one, to never question, even in the face of an unjust war like Vietnam, a member of the military service and commitment. But additionally, that often there are just wars. And when an individual commits service to a war like World War II, their commitment to preserving a freedom like democracy is particularly important. But I'll also say that one thing I learned is both of my parents are immigrants from Egypt. They lived in an authoritarian society where they were not granted democratic freedoms and rights, and I still have family members who live there. And unfortunately, even though there was a North African campaign in World War II, people in North Africa are not granted the same democratic rights and freedoms that have been preserved as a result of World War II. So that means that I just have an acute awareness of the importance of these individual sacrifices, given that not everybody in our world today has been granted these rights and freedoms.
Nice answer. David Fawcett is wondering what the name of the cemetery is in France. Do you know what that is?
Yes, it's the American Normandy Cemetery. I don't know if there's another name.
Hopefully that answers David's question. So Selma, what do you want to do when you get out of high school?
Well, I'd like to go to college. And after I complete my undergraduate degree, perhaps go to law school and ultimately study international law or international economics. I'm interested in international relations. So I don't know if that means being a member of the Foreign Service or working for a think tank or something, but I have strong interest in that field.
I have no doubt you will be successful at whatever you decide to do.
Thank you.
It was a stellar talk. Katie, how about it? Can we hear a little bit from you and what this has meant for you and your other students?
I think first, Selma, I think probably the most important thing for me is the relationship with Selma. I've never done anything like this with a student. I've taught for 15 years. I have students I still, know from the first years that I taught, all of those kinds of things. But this was a pretty daunting project, emotionally, intellectually, all of that. And to walk side by side with a student that way, it was a gift. And I so appreciate that. Another thing that was really powerful for me as we were doing this research, we were following him in census records, and we came across this record from when he was really young, and I looked at the address and I thought, I know that area. And we punched the address into Google Maps. And sure enough, when I was going to the University of Minnesota to get my teaching license, I lived across the street from where Larry Riley grew up, like across the street. And that was a really good reminder that we walk in the shadows of these people, and we don't even know it. And every day that I turned out of my little apartment parking lot, I drove by his house. And so that was a reminder of the importance of this service and that it's with us all the time, even if we don't even know it.
Very cool. Are there other questions out there that we have for Selma or Katie? I don't have any more on the chat list other than a slew of people saying how fabulous the program was. Although one person did ask, this has been recorded, and so you will be able to find it so that you can rewatch it. And then I guess another question came in from Al saying, were you able to interview any of the surviving members of the 100?
Everyone, or just her name is Dale.
I think the question is, did we interview anybody from the 101st Airborne?
Correct.
Yeah, we did not. We were looking for people who would be connected to his unit. So Selma can talk about this, but she actually their Facebook pages and things like that for these units. So we would contact them and they would give us what they could, but we couldn't find anybody close enough to him. The reality is there's a lot written about the 101st, partly because of Band of Brothers. So you can read a lot of these interviews and see all of that. The other thing is these men who were there they're very old. And so there are not many left, and you can't always get a hold of them, but we certainly read those interviews. Selma, if you want to talk about kind of your work with going with for the unit and things like that.
Yes, so there is a Facebook group for the 101st for surviving members and also their family members. And there's, I don't remember the platform, but another similar social media platform that's not quite as popular that I think is focused at connecting veterans. So I made an account on both of those pages and I communicated with surviving members, but my interactions with them were pretty brief, so I never had a formal interview. But I did was in close contact with, I think, the granddaughter of a member of the 101st, and she's the one who actually provided us with the morning report that indicated when Larry Riley had passed away. So that was a really interesting experience that I was able to have from that Facebook group.
Cool. Somebody here was wondering if you had any information on what happened to PFC Lawrence's wife. Was there any info on her?
Yes, she was very reluctant to speak about the war in the household, so that's part of the reason that the children knew very little about their father. And then she married very quickly, remarried afterwards, just a few years after he passed away.
Well, I think for most people who lose a spouse, it can be very difficult, and how to explain it to children and that sort of thing is always kind of hard. And sometimes people just moved on and just wanted to keep going. So it's sad because you lose a part of history, but it's completely understandable from their point of view. And I think, let me see. Was interesting, somebody here said, excellent takeaway. We baby boomers were exquisitely aware of the difference between our World War II parents' war and Vietnam War. I did not realize that we had passed that down to our kids, which I think is a big takeaway point. Sometimes we forget how much, what we're made of and how we feel about something, that we pass it on, not intentionally sometimes, without the entire story. So thank you for sharing that about your family. I think that is it, unless there are any words from anybody else. Katie and Selma, thank you so very, very much for coming and sharing this with us. This was huge. Next week, for our next Friday feature, we have Richard Houston from the Faribault Rotary Club coming to speak about a view from the front lines, polio eradication in Pakistan. He went and took a trip there, kind of on his own accord. It's fascinating. So anyone who can make it, please go ahead and register for that event. And we will see you all next week. Have a fabulous weekend.